Hello, everyone, and welcome to LunchBytes. We are so excited to have you, and welcome to another episode. Before we get started, we're just going to go over our code of conduct. And so in today's episode, we expect everyone to be aware of others, be welcoming and respectful, being understanding of differences, being patient and friendly, being open to all questions and viewpoints, and being kind and considerate of others, especially in the chat. For accessibility, for today's show will be available live with captions on Learn TV and YouTube, and please use the selector below the video. Captions will be available. I'm Steph Rogers. I'm one of the developer audience GTMs here over at the Microsoft team for the UK, and I help run a lot of our big customer events. And this is Annika.
Hi everyone, my name's Annika. I am the Digital and App Innovation Specialist at Microsoft, so I'm helping other businesses and customers digitally transform their journeys. And usually we're joined by Tag, who isn't here yet, but yeah, I think he'll join us next week.
Yes, looking forward to him coming back.
So before we start, I'm just going to do a quick what is LunchBytes. So it's a show that we air every 2 weeks, and we're usually joined by technical experts from all over the UK to answer all of your top questions about Azure. So if you have any questions or any suggestions for our next LunchByte, please message us, let us know by emailing us at lunchbytes@microsoft.com.
Awesome.
Cool. Okay, so today our topic is identity and integration, and we're joined by Vincent, who will shortly introduce himself. Hi, Vincent.
Hello. Thank you, Annika. You can hear me, yes?
We can hear you. Do you want to give a quick introduction?
Yes, sir. So Vincent Rouet, I'm a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. I'm specialized on building enterprise integration solution, cloud native solutions on Microsoft Azure using Azure Integration Services. I've been in Microsoft for 6 years. And today I've chosen to talk to you about a concern that we often come across when implementing integration solution on Azure, which is around security. And how do you securely make services talk to each other, communicate securely using identity? So I'll start with the session now. Annika, am I ready to go?
Good luck. We'll just say really quick for those of you who are on the call, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat as much as you want. We'll capture questions at the end, so feel free to hold on to those, but put them in the chat. We'll get them to Vincent and we'll collect those. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, let's get going. So first of all, I'll just go through a couple of slides, and then I have a pre-recorded video that will show you an example on how you can implement security with identity on Azure Integration Services. So why do we need identity? First of all, historically in traditional IT, users have been getting access to backend data and systems through the desktop, their computer, connected to the network and the organization. So all ring fence behind firewalls and network. And then in addition to that, in terms of getting application level access, you use your organization, your enterprise Active Directory to authenticate and authorize the users to access the database. But with cloud now, this landscape has changed. And as customers have been building custom applications on PaaS or serverless, but also as enterprise are adopting more and more SaaS, software as a service platform, you still need to authenticate the users and use identity. So here the challenge is you are outside your organization. So here the solution is to start replicating your users to a directory in the cloud. So in the case of the Microsoft platform, it's Azure Active Directory, so that the users can authenticate on the systems on premises, but also connect to the system in the cloud. But that's not the full landscape. And the full landscape is today more like this, where not only you have application in the cloud, but you also have access of users no longer accessing through the organization desktops or computers, but accessing from their own device. You also have partners and consumers who you want to grant access and identify to access your application and your data. And beyond users, you have Internet of Things. So you have things that you need to identify, to authenticate to your platforms to access your application. I've also indicated on the top right-hand side that more and more of our customers that we see are using the Power Platform, which is a software as a service platforms to build application. Then they also need to connect to their corporate data. And the safe way to do that, because they're not connected to the network, is to use identity. So you can use Azure Active Directory as an identity provider, but you can also work with any other trusted public identity providers like I have listed here on the slide. So when working with identity and building cloud-native solutions, you need to work with concept of zero trust principle. And here are really the guidance you will need to follow. And principles are to verify explicitly, to use least privileged access, and to always assume breach. So this is a very vast topic. We could use a whole season of episode of LunchBytes to cover this topic. But today I'll just go through an example of the authenticate and authorized and how you can implement this on Azure. So thank you for putting the link here, Emily or Annika. For if you want more information about the zero trust, go and have a look at the Microsoft documentation on the link provided. So to apply this, to implement such a solution, you need an identity platform. And the Microsoft Azure platform is an extensive set of OAuth 2 and OpenID compliant services that I'll be using. I'll also be using the user interface that we use most of the time, which is the Azure portal, to manage the different objects that we'll create in our directory. And also show you an example of how you can use the Microsoft Graph API. So here's the example that I will be going through today in a demo. Pretty simple use case that we often see is, I've got a database, SQL database with a table with some products, but I would like to make these products available to my business users, to my pro dev, the local developers that want to be able to create applications in Power Platforms or from other applications and safely access to that data. You don't want to give them access to your database. So what you want to do, you want to expose this data through a REST API. And for that, I'll use the Logic Apps to quickly create an API. And then I'll expose it through API management. So let's start with the demo. So if I could please change to the video, Emily or Annika, thank you. So here we start with the first step is to create the SQL database, the product table, and the store procedure. So I'll start by creating the SQL database. So for that, I go to the marketplace and I search for the Azure SQL. So you'll see that you have three options for hosting a database. I'm choosing the PaaS option. So I need to give a name to the database. So I'll give it DB products. I'm spending a bit of time here on showing you how to create the database because there's an important aspect here already. So when you create a server, so you give it a name, it has to be unique, you specify a region. But you see here, you have to specify only access using Azure Active Directory. So you no longer want to authorize SQL authentications. You want to make sure you only grant access to the SQL database using Azure Active Directory. So I'm creating the database. And while it's creating, and now it's been created, I move to the Azure Data Studio. Azure Data Studio is a tool for database developers. It allows you to connect and execute some queries. Some DBAs, advanced SQL developers might prefer the SQL Management Studio, but this tool is quite handy to navigate and discover the database that you have available. So I select the database I want to use. You see I'm logged in using my AAD account. So I connect to the database, and you see I've got an empty database that I created just before. So Data Studio is very similar to Visual Studio Code. One of the advantages is you can see here, you can run some queries, and you can execute some script that you have in the same repository that next to your solution application, your infrastructure as code, whether in Bicep or on templates. So it means all the team, whether it's database developers creating the data definition language scripts, or the Azure developers creating the database, the Azure services, all use the same repository. So here I'm executing some script, creating the table, putting some data in the table, and creating a store procedure. So the store procedure is the way I'll be getting access to the data. I won't be exposing the table. The interface, if you like, to my table will be the store procedure. So you see now I've got the store procedure and the table that have been created, and I can test that I can execute the store procedure and get the data here. Okay, so now I've got the database. So I want to now expose this table as a REST API. So for that, I'm going to be using a logic apps that will allow me to quickly create an API. And remember, I've said, you can only get to my data if you are known in the Azure Active Directory. So here, the trick is to use to give an identity to the logic apps. And on Azure, you can do that by using managed identity. So the concept is that for every services that you have and you deploy on Azure, you can grant it and give it an app registration object in Azure Active Directory, and we will be granting access to this object to the SQL database. The front end of the REST API for now is just consumed using the same SaaS token, which is the default way to access logic apps when you create one by default. So let's go now and create the logic apps. So back to the marketplace, I'll select logic app. I'll give it a unique name in a region. I use the consumption tier, which is the easiest to use, and I create the logic app, which is now being created. So what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be using the designer. So I've got the option to choose a template. So the template will give me multiple predefined workflows, and I want to use the request response one here, which is the one we use by default whenever we create a REST API with logic app. So I land in the page where I've got the two actions. One is to receive the request, and one is to send the response back. So I'm creating a method which will be a get. And I'm going to be sending back some data as a response. So just creating a simple JSON value here. Okay, so I save, and then you see when I save, I'm going to be getting a URL with a predefined SaaS token. So I copy this URL, and then I go to my favorite REST testing tool. So I've created a workspace, and I'm just going to create a new request. I'm showing you this because when you start creating REST APIs, working with identities, you're going to be needing to do a lot of testing. So it's best if you have a tool where you can start getting yourself organized from the start, naming your APIs, where you're calling them from, etc. So you can see here, I'm getting the value. So my API works. So now I want to go and connect to the SQL database. So next step is to connect with an action using the SQL Server connector. So here's the connector. And the first thing you need to do, so I want to execute a store procedure. Remember, I've created a store procedure called get products. First thing I need to do is to create a connection to the SQL database. And we've said that we can't have a SQL authentication. We need to use an identity one. So what I want to use is Logic Apps Manage Identity. I want to Logic Apps itself to authenticate to the SQL database, but it doesn't work at this stage because it tells me that I haven't created the identity. So I need to, for now, delete the step. And then under the settings, I go to identity. So you'll find that on Microsoft Azure portal, under settings, you will find these options to create managed identity for pretty much all the Azure services now, and they're all under the same location under settings. So creating the value in the Azure Active Directory. So I'm keeping the name here. So my Logic app is called API LA products. And if I go and look at the Active Directory of my tenant, I just want to show you that if you go and search the tenant, you will find that the object, the actual API, has been created. So important thing to understand here, when you're working with identity with Azure Active Directory, whether it's services or consumers, they will all need to have an identity in your Active Directory. So now what I'm going to do here is, remember we said SQL will only allow for an identity from Azure Active Directory. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to create a user. I don't know what happened there. I'm going to create a user for the Logic app. So you can see the create user. I've got the name of the Logic apps from external provider. And this query will actually create a user in the database, and it will implicitly grant login to the database. And then the second query, grant execute, will say this user is allowed to execute the get product query, store procedure. Okay, so right. So okay, so we're now back to the Logic app. Sorry, it went ahead a little bit, but so I've added the SQL Server action again. So what I need to do here, I need to go and specify the SQL Server URL, the database name. So I need to enter the value. So the Logic app has managed identities can only execute the store procedure. It doesn't have role to actually navigate the database for the object, or even Azure for that matter. So there's a reason that's why I need to enter those values manually. But once I've connected, you can see it then now knows, okay, I've got access to that database. I can go and find the object I'm allowed to query, to execute. So this is an important aspect here, that only the Logic apps is authorized to execute the store procedure. So I can save. Now, instead of this JSON value, I want to get the table result set that the store procedure returns. And if I go back to, so I've now saved, and if I go back to Postman and I once again execute the Logic app, call the Logic apps, I'm now getting the JSON value as a response. So pretty quick to go and expose a SQL database table as a JSON through a REST API. So next step is to now say, okay, I've got my REST API that's identified. I don't know why it's keep jumping here. So, okay, I've executed it. So now what we want to do, we have access to the token. So we want to use identity to protect the API instead. So if you want more information about how you can use the Microsoft Identity Platform, here's a link that will be shared. So now let's go and create the object in the Azure Active Directory that will be used to represent the actual logic apps in Active Directory. So I go and create an object in Azure Active Directory, which will represent my logic apps. So here the idea is that, remember, for every interaction between a consumer and a backend service, both needs to have an identity object created in Azure Active Directory. And here, the object I'm creating, so this is for the logic apps. The logic app will say, hey, I'm exposing an API. So for that API, first of all, you will need to have a unique identifier, because this will be used whenever you need to refer when you authorize the access as the audience. So you get given a GUI ID by default, but it's better if you give it a meaningful name here. So that name will be unique. And then I also need to create a scope that will be used to specify the remit within which the logic apps can be called. And then now I'm going to go and create a second one, which will be for the consumer. Now it means the Postman that I will use. So whenever I'll be using calling the logic app from Postman, I will need to represent this as an object in Azure Active Directory as well. So now I've got this created. So what I do, I need to go and grant. So this consumer, I'm going to say, hey, this consumer is allowed to access my API. So if I go and navigate to my API, so the object, and this is getting to the role that I want to grant permissions to access it. So I need to grant admin access to it. So here I've said that this consumer is allowed to access the logic apps. So I need also to create a secret. So the secret will be used to whenever I try to get the token. So you can see there's a lot of object involved, which is why you really need to be organized in the way you create your object, in the way you document and reference the different objects. So now if I'm back to Postman, I execute the logic app, so you can see I have access. But if I remove the token, I get unauthorized. So I'm not allowed to access these logic apps anymore. So 4.1 unauthorized. So what I need to do, I need to go back to the Azure portal. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to be adding a policy to the logic apps for the authorization. So here, the policy will say, you need to authenticate whenever you get presented with JOT tokens. You need to authenticate and make sure that the user is, whoever is calling the logic app is authorized to execute the logic apps. So I'll give it a name. The issuer here is the authority that will validate against which you will validate the authorization. And then you specify the audience. So remember, the audience is a single URI that I created. Here, unfortunately, you can't use value. You have to use the object ID. certainly something that could be improved from a developer experience point of view. So now I've saved the policy, and if I execute, it won't work. I will get unauthorized. So what I need to do, I need to present a token to the logic apps. So here I'm using a nice feature of Postman, which has got this little utility tool, so you can use to go and fetch a token from the identity provider. So I'm using the client credentials patterns because this is an application calling another application. I specify the client ID. Okay, so that was quite quick. Let me just come back a little bit here if I can. Okay, so the video went quite quick here, but so what happens basically is I went to query, I got the token, I used the tokens to call the logic apps, and then the token, as you can see here, it contains the role that it will check, the token actually contains to authorize the execution of the logic apps. So I apologize for the rendering here of the video, which seems to have a bit of delay at times. So the next step now is to introduce API management, and API management will be used now to call the logic apps instead of using Postman. So the idea of using an API management is that you want to use an API. API management is an API gateway. So the API gateway has a number of additional features that you can use to implement an even better set of security features for your APIs that you have on the backend. So remember that APIs might be implementing using logic apps, functions, different kind of services, but you don't always have the possibility to implement identity for your backend API. So exposing them through an API gateway, such as API management, allow you to implement identity authorization for all your APIs and having them all under one single tool, and you have consistency as to the way you access your APIs. So I'm saving the API, and it's now deploying the API management instance. So the API management instance have been created. So what I need to do here, I need to expose the logic app. So I can use a nice feature that exists in API management is you can go and search, navigate for the logic apps that you have, and you can see it found the logic apps that I had created. And I quickly end up with the API being listed here, and I can go and test. And if I test the execution of the API, you can see I can successfully access it. Now, we protected it with identity. So why is it that I can access it? It's because it still has the SaaS token. Okay, so we said we only want to use identity. So I need to go and remove the SaaS token that it inserted automatically for me as part of the wizard. So I remove the value here. So if I go and test again, so you can see it's now unauthorized. Okay. So if we come back to here, the way the design is built. So remember, when exposing an API through API management, you first have Azure API management exposing the APIs, but then it does a rewrite of the URL. And the second part, you need to authenticate. So it's the backend is API management and now needs to authenticate to logic apps. So the same thing, you want to use managed identity. So you enable managed identity for API management. and you're going to get the same thing. API management is going to be is going to have an object. Here I'm showing the Graph API. So now that I've got an API management object in Azure Active Directory, I'm going to use the Microsoft Graph APIs to go and grant access to the logic apps for API management. So we need to give API management the permissions to access the logic apps. So I execute the query here. It's been successfully executed. And if I go back and look at the Active Directory, if I search for API management, so this is the enterprise application object I've got in Active Directory. You can see here, if I refresh a couple of times, you can see now that there you go, the API management has been granted access to the claim, to the Logic Apps API LA products. So going back to API management, what I'm going to need to do now, I'm going to need to add a policy to the API. So the purpose is to say API management, when you will be calling the backend API, which is the Logic Apps, you will need to authenticate yourself. And to authenticate yourself, you will be using managed identity. So this takes place in the design phase. So just testing once. That's an authorized. So I click on the operation. And this is here where I need to add the actual policy. So it's policy, and I specify the results, which is the Logic Apps. This is the Logic App policy that we'll need to check that whoever is presenting the token is authorized. So if I now go back to execute to store the API, you can see now I'm granted access to the Logic Apps through API management. And if you scroll down and look at what happened, there's no token. Remember, removed it. However, this time it says that the messaging got a managed identity validation. So this time, so what we want to do next is we want to add the last part, which is making sure that applications that access API management are also using identity to connect. So same principle, I need to create objects in Azure Active Directory that represent my API management. It needs to expose an API. So the same way, I will create a single value for the service. It's always the same concept. Whenever you are implementing identity, you have this pair of app registration object, one representing the service that implements a scope or a role, and another one that represents the consumer that you need to provide or set permissions to the backend service. So we created a pair of objects for the Logic App for API management to the Logic Apps, and now we're doing one for the consumer to the API management. Okay, so now we go back to Azure Active Directory. So we created the service, the object for the API management, and now we're going to go and create one for the consumer. So in this case, we are on the last part of the whole end-to-end identity chain, if you like. And this is really the object that will be used by whoever client will access the API. So whether it's Postman, whether it's the Power Platform, or whether it's another custom application. So I grant access, admin access to the role, and I also need to get a secret here. Right, so now we're back to API management. So what we're going to do now, we're going to implement the last part of the authentication for the API, which is authenticate the token when it arrives, when it lands on API management. So you can see here, I can still have access, okay. And I'm going to be using this URL in Postman because I'll need to create a token, so I'll need to use this tool as well. So still access API management query, but there's no authentication at this stage. So I'm going to go and add a policy to the methods. So here the policy that I'm adding is pasted here. So I've left some blank values here. So I need to go and get the tenant ID. So I can get the tenant ID from the list of endpoints. A lot of different locations. You could copy and paste that value. And then I can also go and get the role. So the role is the specific action that I specified as part of the API management app registration. So if I save, if I try to test again, so here I've added a policy that will check authorization when calling the API management. And you can see now I'm again getting a 4.1 unauthorized. And same thing from Postman. So same way that when I was calling the logic apps, I'm going to go and fetch a token from the Active Directory. So I had the token name for logic apps. I'll be using a new one. It just happened that so the issuer is the same tenant. I know to get the token ID for the consumer, the application ID. So it happens to be similar value. And then the client secrets, which happen to be there already. So I go and get the application URI. Happens to be the same, and then I can go and get the access token. So it gets the token. I say use this token. So I'm calling the API management using the token, which contains the value that grants me access to this API. So if I have a look at the value, like again in jot.io, if I look at the value, I can see that the audience is for API catalog, and the product it's got the role that it needs to have access to API management. So we just finished by looking at an example. If I now want to consume this API from Power Automate, from the Power Platform. So you could create an API, you could create a Power Automate that will get your product. And then, so you can create a reusable flow that will get your product catalog from your database table. And here the advantage really is to think about how you've taken your SQL database, which is back in your organization backend, and you're making it available through a REST API, and it's protected through identity. So you're not connected to the network. You have access to the backend systems. I think if I just advance a little bit here, I wasted a bit of time here doing all the entering the values. So I provide a client ID. Here I can use the same that I've used in Postman and a secret. Okay, so I can save. And then I can test the value. So you can see the flow is now executing. So I can, from Power Automate, get the data. So here the advantage is that you enable your business users, your pro devs, with the people that create value for your business. They can get access to your data back in your backend systems and protect it through identity. I'll just show you here what I've done is using the secret in the HTTP call is not a best practice. So you need to use the key vault instead to store the secrets and use the key vault get secrets to fetch the value that you will use in the HTTP call, which means that whoever users are using these applications or this API won't have to know at any time the value of the secret. So Emily, Annika, that completes the demo.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vincent. That was incredibly helpful. And now that we didn't see any lag on our end as well while we watched. So thank you so much for putting that demo together. And I'm really glad it ran smoothly.
Thank you, Emily.
We have a few questions that we can ask if that's okay, Vincent.
Sure, yeah.
So the first question is, can I use a different identity provider than Azure Active Directory in API management?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, you can see when we were editing the API management, there was an issuer or an identity provider. So you can specify any other trusted identity providers that will independently go and validate the token. Yes, so that's possible.
Perfect. And if protecting the backend API with identity, why would I need API management?
So as I was mentioning during the demo, you need to think about how an applications might be composed of multiple APIs. And sometimes your APIs, you will use Logic Apps, you will use Azure Functions, but you might also be calling APIs from some of your ERPs, from some of your application systems. And all APIs don't have the same support for identity. So some APIs might not even be able to have identity protection. So using an API management, an API gateway allows you to build that identity layer in front of all your APIs and to have a consistent approach to managing security and identity access to your backend APIs.
So if that's the case, do I also need to protect the logic apps with identity? If protecting with API management.
So here, the best practice recommendation is protect at every layer if possible. So this is a good question that sometimes you think, well, I'm taking care of identity with API management. I don't need to worry about the backend APIs. And in fact, you do. And it's better if you have identity at every layer if possible. There's a way to make sure that API logic apps can only be called by your API management instance. But if you think about situations where someone might get access to the logic apps, you want to make sure that they won't be able to access it unless they are identified and authorized to do it. So the answer would be yes, you need to, if possible.
Thank you. And last question, can I add API management and logic apps to a private network as well then?
Yes, this is in fact, as I was mentioning in the start of presentations, we see many of our customers coming from a traditional IT mindset where they think, everything has to be protected by the network. And a lot of customers tend to want to do anything which is to do with cloud solution, PaaS or serverless, to be as part of the network as much as possible. So the services have been built to support network integration. So API management, logic apps, functions can run within the private network. But I come across more and more scenarios and use cases where data is not even in a network anymore. And so you have end-to-end public hosted services. So yes, it's possible, but it doesn't mean you don't need to have identity protection as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Vincent, for answering all the questions. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to write them in the comments below. And if it's after the live, then we might come back and answer some of them later.
Yes, Vincent, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll go ahead and say goodbye from now, and we'll jump into the updates for this week and going into next. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Vincent.
Thank you.
All right, so the developer news radar. So typically in this segment of the session, we would have Ty come in and do his developer news radar. But for this week, we're going to dive right into the upcoming events that we have coming down the pipeline. Also, before we jump into that, so if you're interested in running and being a part of an open hack in the UK or having a Cloud Skills Challenge run in your customer group, just reach out to your account manager. And if you have any other questions or topics that you'd like to see highlighted in LunchBytes going forward, please drop us a note at lunchbytes@microsoft.com. And now one more. So please go check out the aka.ms/UK developer website. This has all the latest and greatest when it comes to news and different things from beginner programmers to advanced developer content for you. And then please contact your account team about the following upcoming events that you would like to go to. So we have an open hack about Azure migration, which is going to be a virtual event next month, so October 18th through the 20th. We have the Microsoft Azure Virtual Days, September through October. And we have Microsoft Ignite, aka.ms/ignite, October 12th through the 14th. And again, everything is on our website, aka.ms/UK developer, or you can reach out to your account team. And coming up next week, we have Sam, who is one of our cloud solution architects, and he'll be here with us October 5th. So mark your calendars to be back on this channel October 5th to check out him and listen more about application modernization for .NET and Java apps. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll chat next time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.